Frozen beneath a Greenland riverbank, for 600 years a single farm was waiting to unravel the only account of how an entire Norse colony vanished. Historians say the settlers died out because they refused to adapt. They're wrong. The ground just proved the opposite. The only official record came from the church, one report of an empty farm that stood unquestioned for 6 centuries. In 1991, archaeologist Jetty Arneborg watched 600-year-old timber surface from a frozen Greenland riverbank that should have destroyed it, and what came out from underneath was about to finally make the church's record look incomplete. Here's the story most people already think they know. Norse settlers came to Greenland, built farms in a land too cold for them, refused to adapt, and starved to death because they were too stubborn to fish, too proud to eat seal, too attached to European farming to survive an Arctic winter. It's a clean story. It has a moral. Pride goes before a fall. Ignore the environment and the environment kills you, and for a long time that's exactly how the disappearance of the Western settlement got taught. It's the version in popular books. It's the version repeated on documentary after documentary. It fits neatly into what we want history to teach us about hubris. There's just one problem. The people who actually excavated these farms don't believe it anymore. And the deeper you look at the only surviving eyewitness account of what happened, the stranger that account gets. Let's start with why any of this mattered in the first place. In the year 985, Eric the Red led an expedition of Icelandic settlers to Greenland, founding 2 colonies along its southwestern coast. The larger, called the Eastern Settlement, sat further south. The smaller, called the Western Settlement, sat further north, near the fjord where the modern capital Nuuk now stands. Despite the name, it wasn't west of anything. It was north. That's detail one that most people get wrong, and it matters because for centuries, popular accounts have blurred the Western Settlement story together with the Eastern Settlement story, even though they are 2 different disappearances on 2 different timelines, roughly a century apart. The Western Settlement held around 95 farms and somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people at its height, a quarter the size of its southern neighbor. These weren't primitive huts. They were European-style turf-walled longhouses with cattle barns, dairies, churches, and at the head of one fjord, a chieftain's manor with its own consecrated ground. The economy ran on sheep, goats, and cattle, supplemented by seal hunting, caribou, fishing, and one commodity that made Greenland matter to the rest of medieval Europe, walrus ivory. By the 1100s, Norse Greenland had become Europe's dominant supplier of walrus tusk, the raw material behind crucifixes, chess pieces, and carved luxury goods across the continent. This wasn't a marginal colony scraping by at the edge of the map. It was a working link in a European trade network, exporting a prestige material that European buyers couldn't easily get anywhere else. That's the version people respected. Ambitious, connected, prosperous, or at least prosperous enough to matter. And then, sometime in the mid-1300s, it went quiet. The man who found it quiet was Ivar Bardarson, a Norwegian cleric sent to Greenland around 1341 to oversee the church's holdings at the bishop's seat. At some point during his years there, he sailed north to the Western Settlement and found it empty. His account, translated later into Danish and preserved only in that later form, describes no people, no bodies, no burned buildings, and no sign of struggle, just cattle and sheep and goats wandering loose across abandoned farmland with nobody left to milk them, herd them, or bring them in before winter. His crew, according to the account, slaughtered as many animals as they could carry and sailed back south. That's the origin of the mystery. And here's the first crack, the detail that should have made historians pause centuries ago, and mostly didn't. Livestock don't survive Greenland winters on their own. Sheep and goats are hardy, but cattle and horses need shelter, stored fodder, and human management to make it through a Norse Greenland winter. If the Western Settlement's people vanished suddenly, in whatever catastrophe ended them, their cattle should have died with them, or shortly after them, not been found wandering the countryside in apparent good health. Something about that description doesn't line up biologically. Either Bardarsson's crew arrived within days of whatever happened, catching the animals in a brief window before they too succumbed, or the picture he painted was already softened secondhand or partly embellished by the time it reached the page that survives. And there's another problem buried in that word survives. We don't have Bardarsson's original report. What we have is a later copy, edited and translated into Danish, compiled well after his lifetime. Every detail historians have repeated for 600 years. The empty farms, the wandering cattle, the eerie silence, comes to us filtered through at least one layer of scribal handling we can't fully verify. That doesn't mean the account is false. It means it's the only witness statement in a case that is 600 years old, and it's never been cross-examined, because until recently, there was nothing to cross-examine it against. That changed in 1991 when two caribou hunters, walking along an eroding riverbank roughly 80 kilometers east of Nuuk, noticed timber sticking out of the sand. What they'd found would become known as the farm beneath the sand, Gården under Sandet, or GUS, and it would give archaeology something Bardarsson's report never could, a scene that hadn't been edited by 6 centuries of retelling. To understand why Gus mattered, you need to understand what almost never survives in archaeology. Wood rots, textiles disintegrate, insects vanish within years. Normally, when you dig up a 500-year-old farm, you find stone foundations, some bone, and not much else. The organic story, the part that actually tells you how people lived and how they left, is usually long gone. But this farm hadn't just been abandoned. At some point, after people stopped living there, meltwater, carrying fine sand, buried the site under more than a meter of sediment. And then the Arctic climate did something almost accidental. It froze the whole thing solid. Not decayed, not looted, frozen, the way a body is frozen, preserved in the exact condition it was left in, waiting 600 years for someone to dig it back out. Jetty Arneborg, working with the Danish National Museum and colleagues from Greenland's own National Museum, led a full excavation of the site across 5 summers, from 1991 to 1996. What came out of that frozen ground reads less like an archaeological report and more like a crime scene inventory. Fragments of looms and cloth, an iron knife, whetstones, soapstone vessels, a double-edged comb, antler arrows, metal hinges and locks, wooden barrels, intact enough to identify their construction, and something almost absurdly mundane that told excavators exactly what kind of building they were standing in before they'd even confirmed it. Rock-hard, centuries-old sheep droppings, frozen in place since before the structure was buried. One researcher involved in the dig later described the sensation of opening these frozen layers as something closer to smell memory than archaeology. 500-year-old odors, sealed since before the building went under the sand, released the moment the ground was cut open. That's not the kind of detail you get from stone ruins. That's the kind of detail that makes a 600-year-old farm feel like it was abandoned last week. The textiles alone became a major study of their own, cataloged and published years later by textile historian Else Ostergaard. Dozens of numbered fragments, including weaving techniques and embroidery work that told researchers exactly how skilled and how connected to broader European craft traditions these supposedly isolated colonists remained, right up until the end. And then there was the bone. Zooarchaeologist Inge Bodker Enghoff eventually cataloged more than 8,000 identified bone fragments from the site, representing at least 36 species of fish, bird, and mammal, including the largest fish bone sample recovered from any Norse Greenland site up to that point. Sheep and goats dominated the herd. Cattle were present, but likely kept mainly for milk rather than meat. There was a single pig bone. There were dog skulls from greyhound-type animals, and a noticeable number of horse bones, both signs of status rather than pure subsistence farming. None of that reads like a starving, isolated colony too stubborn to adapt. It reads like a working farm with skilled textile production, functioning livestock management, and a diet that, when researchers looked closer, was shifting steadily toward the sea. That shift is where the story stops being about one farm and starts becoming a controlled scientific test of the entire stubborn Europeans theory. Researchers Jet Arnebor, Jan Heinemeyer, and Niels Linnerup ran stable isotope analysis, first on a smaller sample and later on roughly 80 Norse skeletons recovered from Eastern and Western Settlement churchyards. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes locked into human bone collagen record, essentially, what a person actually ate over the years before death. Terrestrial food leaves one chemical signature, and marine food leaves another. The results showed that around the year 1000, Norse Greenlanders ate a mostly land-based diet, maybe 20 to 30% seafood at most. By the time the colonies were ending, that had reversed. Marine food, mostly seal, made up somewhere between 50 and 80% of what people ate. That is not the signature of a population too proud to change their habits. That's the signature of a population that adapted steadily, generation after generation, right up until the end. Linnerup himself later put it more bluntly than most academic papers dare to. Nothing in the isotope record suggests a natural catastrophe wiped these people out. If anything, he suggested, they may simply have grown tired of a diet built almost entirely around seal meat, at the edge of the known world. So if they weren't too stubborn to change, and they weren't wiped out by a single disaster, what actually happened? This is where the story used to offer a tempting shortcut, and it's worth pausing on why that shortcut felt so believable for so long. Barterson's own account, or at least the later editorial hand behind it, pointed a finger at the Inuit, the Skraelings, as the source of the Western settlement's silence. It's an easy narrative. Outside threat arrives, defenseless colony falls, mystery solved. Except archaeology has never backed it up. There's no destruction layer at the Western settlement, no mass grave, no skeletal trauma consistent with a raid or massacre. What Norse artifacts do turn up at Inuit sites, and what limited Inuit material shows up at Norse sites look far more like trade contact than warfare. A 2018 genetic study of walrus remains even suggests Norse hunters and Thule communities interacted across a wide swath of the high Arctic, further north than anyone previously assumed. Another sign that points toward contact and exchange, rather than conquest. The Inuit attack theory hasn't been formally retracted from history in some dramatic press conference. It's simply been quietly abandoned by the researchers who've actually excavated the sites, because the evidence to support it was never there. If it wasn't conflict and it wasn't stubborn starvation, the physical evidence points somewhere else entirely. And this is where the GUS stops being just a single well-preserved farm and starts being a pattern, because the farm wasn't occupied continuously and then abandoned once. The stratigraphy at GUS shows it was lived in, left, and reoccupied at least 3 separate times before its final desertion. People walked away from this farm, came back, rebuilt, and left again, more than once across its working life. That's not the behavior of a community caught off guard by catastrophe. That's the behavior of a community managing hardship, the way farming communities have always managed hardship, by retreating when conditions turn bad and returning when they improve, until eventually they don't return at all. And here's a detail that should bother you more than it usually gets credit for. When archaeologists reach the final abandonment layers of Western settlement farms. The valuables are largely missing. Jewelry, church metalwork, anything genuinely portable and worth carrying isn't sitting in the ruins waiting to be found. People took their belongings with them. That's not what a population fleeing an attack or dying in place leaves behind. That's what a population leaves behind when it packs up and goes somewhere else, deliberately, with time to plan. So Gus tells a story of managed retreat, orderly, repeated, deliberate, which would be a tidy answer if it weren't for the farm next door. Not far from Gus sits another Western settlement farmstead known as Nepotsok, and when researchers Eva Panagiotokopoulou, Paul Buckland, and Peter Skidmore applied a technique most viewers have never heard of to compare these two farms, the result complicated everything the G-West story had just settled. The technique is fossil insect analysis. And here's the plain version of how it works. Certain fly species only thrive in warm, occupied human dwellings. They're synanthropic, meaning they live alongside people and need continuous human warmth and activity to survive indoors in the Arctic. When a farm is actively lived in, those species dominate the insect record preserved in the floor layers. When a farm is abandoned and goes cold, those species crash, and cold-tolerant outdoor species, including carrion flies that feed on dead animal or human remains, move in to replace them. The insects, in other words, form a kind of biological seismograph for exactly how a building's occupation ended. At Gus, the warm-adapted housefly species declines gradually across the record, and even the evidence of a dead goat carcass found on the property shows carrion flies feeding on it after the building was already empty, meaning the animal died and was scavenged in an abandoned structure, not inside an occupied one. Calm, gradual, consistent with the departure story the rest of the site tells. At Nepotsok, the same warm, loving fly species is barely present at all, in some samples making up less than 3% of the insect record, compared to as high as 78% at points in the Gus sequence. Instead, cold-tolerant carrion flies dominate the final layers, the kind that only appear in large numbers around exposed dead flesh, in a building that had gone cold, possibly through damage to its roof. Researchers who worked the Nepotsok material also documented something else. In the same final phase, butchered cattle bones in what should have been storage space, evidence consistent with animals slaughtered out of desperation rather than routine, along with the bones of a large domestic dog bearing cut marks, the kind of detail that only shows up when people are eating whatever is left, including animals they wouldn't ordinarily eat. Sit with that contrast for a moment. Two farms, same settlement, same collapsing world around them. One ends the way Gus ends, calm, planned, repeatedly abandoned and reoccupied until the final quiet departure. The other ends the way Nepotsok ends, cold, desperate, eating the animals that shouldn't have been eaten in a building that stopped being warm before anyone chose to leave it. That's not one disappearance, that's two different endings happening under one settlement's name. And that reframes everything Bardarson described. His crew didn't find one uniform ghost town. If Bardarson's men had sailed further, farm to farm, they may have seen exactly this pattern. Some homes closed up carefully by people who'd already decided to go, others left the way Nepotsok was left, in the aftermath of a winter that didn't end the way anyone hoped. A single traveler's report, compressed into a few sentences by a later editor, simply couldn't capture that complexity. It gave us one flat image. The ground gave us two very different stories. Which raises the obvious next question. What actually pushed some of these farms into that kind of ending, if it wasn't a raid and it wasn't stubborn refusal to adapt? For decades, the leading answer was climate, specifically the onset of the Little Ice Age, the centuries-long cooling period that followed the relatively mild medieval warm period the the original settlers had enjoyed. North Atlantic temperature reconstructions do show significant cooling beginning in the late 1200s and early 1300s, with some of the coldest winters in 2,000 years arriving in the late 1300s and early 1400s. A 2011 study led by William D'Andrea using lake sediment chemistry from a site near modern Kangerlussuaq found a clear multi-degree cooling trend in the exact region and exact time frame the Norse were living through. The first quantitative temperature record pulled directly from Norse Greenland itself, rather than inferred from elsewhere. For years that felt like the closing argument. Cold killed the colony. It didn't close the case. It reopened it in a different direction. In 2022, a team led by Boyang Zhao and Raymond Bradley published a study in the journal Science Advances using lake sediment cores from directly beside a former Eastern settlement farm. Their conclusion complicated the tidy cooling narrative significantly. They found no major temperature drop during the core settlement period at all. What they found instead was a persistent, worsening drought, one that continued intensifying well after the Norse were gone, peaking in the 1500s. A colony built around raising livestock on grass doesn't need brutal cold to fail. It needs the grass to stop growing reliably, and drought does exactly that, quietly, over generations, without leaving the dramatic, frozen-in-time imagery people associate with the Little Ice Age. So the cause wasn't simply cold. It may not even have been primarily cold. It was water, or the lack of it, undermining pasture land year after year in ways that wouldn't show up as a single catastrophic event, only as a slow tightening of what the land could support. And then in 2023, researchers led by Marisa Boragine added a factor almost nobody had considered before. One that sounds almost too strange to be real, except it's backed by physical modeling published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. As the Little Ice Age advanced, growing glaciers actually pressed down on the crust beneath them, hard enough to displace the land around Norse settlements, driving local sea levels up by an estimated 3 meters or more across the occupation period, a rate several times faster than 21st century sea level rise. The study found roughly 75% of known Norse sites in Greenland sat within a kilometer of land that would have been affected by this flooding. Farms weren't just losing pasture to drought from above. Some of them were quite literally losing land to rising water from below, a threat rooted in glacial physics that no 14th century farmer could have possibly diagnosed or defended against. Layer all of that onto the economy the settlement actually depended on, and the pressure compounds rather than resolves. Remember the walrus ivory, the trade good that had made Norse Greenland matter to medieval Europe in the first place. In 2018, researchers James Barrett, Bastian Starr, and Sanna Boesenkool analyzed the genetic makeup of walrus ivory recovered from archaeological and museum collections across Europe, tracing which populations of walrus the tusks actually came from. Their results confirmed that by the 1100s, Greenland held something close to a monopoly on Europe's walrus ivory supply. Near total control of a luxury material an entire continent wanted. Monopolies built on one commodity are fragile, and this one broke on two fronts at once. Elephant ivory, more workable and increasingly available through expanding trade routes into Africa, flooded into European markets from the 13th century onward, undercutting demand for the Arctic alternative. And the ships that had carried Greenland's ivory home to Norway had to sail through a Norwegian economy that the Black Death devastated in the mid-14th century, killing roughly half the population and gutting the maritime trade network. Greenland depended on for iron, timber, and contact with the outside world at all. A follow-up study by Barrett's team in 2020, examining a wider set of tusks, found something that reads almost like watching a resource collapse in real time. Later medieval era ivory increasingly came from smaller, often female, walruses, hunted at greater distances than earlier samples. The textbook signature of a resource being pushed harder and harder as the easier, larger populations were depleted closer to home. Hunters chasing an increasingly scarce, increasingly distant commodity for a market that was disappearing anyway. So line it up. A colony whose prosperity depended on a single export commodity watches that commodity lose its market at the exact moment its trade lifeline to Europe collapses under plague. At the exact moment its farmland is being squeezed by drought from one direction and rising water from another. No single event caused what happened to the Western settlement. What caused it was several slow-moving pressures arriving on top of each other at the same time for a population with nowhere else nearby to turn. That reframes the extinction story completely. This wasn't a mystery of what killed them. It's a mystery of how a community absorbs that many compounding failures at once, and what a community actually does when the math stops working. The archaeology increasingly points toward an answer that's less dramatic than a die-off and in some ways more unsettling. They likely left, not all at once, not in a single evacuation, but farm by farm, generation by generation, the outer and more marginal properties abandoned first, according to settlement chronology, work by researcher Christian Koch Madsen, with the population gradually contracting toward the strongest remaining land before thinning out entirely. Population modeling by Niels Linnerup suggests the entire colony could have depopulated through something as unremarkable as 10 to 13 people per year choosing to leave rather than stay, a trickle, not a collapse, spread out across enough decades that no single witness would ever have seen the whole picture, only ever the empty aftermath, the way Barterson did. But here's the honest complication, the one that keeps this from being a neatly solved case. Nobody has found where they went. If Norse Greenlanders immigrated back to Iceland, Norway, or elsewhere in the North Atlantic world, we have no confirmed genetic trace of that return migration. Studies of Greenlandic Inuit populations show no meaningful Norse genetic admixture, which itself argues against large-scale intermarriage or absorption into local communities. And there's no clearly documented genetic signature of a returning Greenlandic Norse population showing up in 14th or 15th century Iceland either. The immigration theory fits the archaeological pattern. The missing valuables, the orderly retreat at farms like GUS, and the settlement contraction chronology better than any competing explanation currently on the table. It just doesn't have a DNA smoking gun to close the loop. The people may have simply dissolved back into the wider medieval world so thoroughly that 600 years later, we can trace their departure but not their destination. That's not a failure of the science. It's an honest limit of what evidence from 6 centuries ago can prove, and it's exactly the kind of loose thread that keeps this case technically open. There's one more twist worth sitting with before this story turns toward the present, and it involves those GUS textiles again. Textile analysis identified what appeared to be exotic animal hair fibers among the fragments recovered from the frozen farm floor. Fibers some researchers argued didn't match any species native to Greenland or typical of European trade goods, raising tantalizing questions about contact reaching further west than anyone expected. Later, ancient DNA reanalysis has challenged those original identifications, and the debate over exactly what those fibers represent and where they actually came from has never been fully closed. File that one under disputed, not confirmed. But it's a reminder that even a site as thoroughly excavated as GUS still has loose threads, literally, that haven't finished being pulled. So where does that leave the accepted version, the one about stubborn Europeans who refused to adapt and starved for it? It's essentially dead. The isotope data shows adaptation, not refusal. The insect data shows 2 very different farm-level endings, not one uniform catastrophe. The ivory market collapse, the drought data, and the sea level modeling show compounding economic and environmental pressure, not a single dramatic villain. In the immigration pattern, missing valuables and all looks less like defeat and more like a difficult, rational decision made by people who understood their situation better than 6 centuries of secondhand storytelling ever gave them credit for. That does not prove every detail of the departure story. It does not tell us exactly where every family went or exactly which winter finally broke which farm, but it makes the simple, old version, the one about pride and stubbornness, considerably harder to defend, and honestly, it makes the real story more interesting than the myth ever was. Here's the part that should worry you more than any 13th century mystery, though. The evidence that finally let researchers cross-examine Bardarsson's account is disappearing again, right now, and this time, nobody's coming back to reoccupy the site. The exact conditions that preserved GUS for 600 years, cold, stable, frozen permafrost soil, are breaking down across Greenland as the Arctic warms. Researcher Jørgen Hollesen and colleagues at the National Museum of Denmark built predictive models published in scientific reports in 2016 and 2019, and the numbers are stark. Depending on how quickly warming continues, their models suggest somewhere between 30 and 70% of the organic archaeological material still buried in Greenland soil could disappear within the next 80 years. Dry inland sites, the exact type GUS represents, sit at the higher end of that range because dry soil lets oxygen reach buried microbes more easily, accelerating decay the moment permafrost stops locking everything in place. This isn't a distant hypothetical. Researcher Konrad Smiarowski, working with the North Atlantic Biocultural Organization Network, surveyed roughly 90 archaeological sites across Greenland and found that most organic samples recovered had already effectively turned to mush, degraded past the point of useful analysis. Out of that entire survey, only a small handful of sites remained cold and stable enough to preserve material the way GUS had been preserved when those hunters first spotted timber in the riverbank in 1991. One researcher involved in tracking this crisis, Paul Holm, described the situation in blunt terms. After decades of finally having the tools to properly study this material, it's vanishing out from under researchers' feet before they can use them. There are more than 180,000 registered archaeological sites across Greenland. There is no realistic way to excavate even a meaningful fraction of them before this window closes. Archaeologists are no longer asking what to dig. They're triaging, choosing which sites are worth racing the thaw for, and accepting that most of the rest will simply dissolve, unread, back into the ground they came from. Which brings the story back to where it started, that riverbank near Nuuk, that frozen farm that gave archaeology its first real chance to check a 600-year-old story against physical evidence instead of a single scribe's second-hand translation. GUS worked because the permafrost held everything exactly where it had been left: textiles, sheep dung, insect casings, animal bone, undisturbed. Since before Columbus crossed an ocean, most Europeans didn't know existed yet. That same ground, right now, in the same Arctic summers that keep arriving warmer than the last, is softening. The Western settlement wasn't wiped out by conflict. It wasn't lost to stubbornness. It came apart slowly, farm by farm, under pressures its people understood well enough to respond to. Drought squeezing their pasture, a market for ivory collapsing beneath them, rising water swallowing land no one had a name for yet, until leaving quietly and deliberately made more sense than staying. Some farms went calm, at least one went hungry and cold before it went silent, and the only written witness to any of it never saw the difference because by the time he arrived, there was nothing left to ask. The ground remembered what the page couldn't. For 600 years, it kept that memory frozen and waiting. It is running out of time to tell the rest.